The photograph fell from the old medical journal like a death sentence, landing face up on Dr. Amanda Walsh's kitchen table with an image that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her father, Dr. Jonathan Walsh, standing beside a hospital bed with a smile of satisfaction as he held a syringe above a patient who would never wake up again. Amanda's hands trembled as she picked up the photograph, dated 15 years earlier, and read the handwritten note on the back. Subject 47, final dose administered successfully. Neurological degradation complete. Time of death, 3:42 a.m. Cause listed as natural complications from existing condition. The medical journal that had contained the photograph was one of dozens Amanda had found in her father's home office while cleaning out his belongings after his funeral 3 weeks earlier. But unlike the prestigious publications and research articles she had expected to find, these journals documented something far more sinister than legitimate medical research. They contained detailed records of what could only be described as human experimentation, systematic murder, and a decades-long career of using his position as one of Boston's most respected physicians to kill vulnerable patients while covering his crimes behind a facade of compassionate end-of-life care. Dr. Jonathan Walsh had died of a heart attack at age 68 while attending a medical conference in Geneva, where he was scheduled to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Association of Medical Ethics for his groundbreaking work in pain management and palliative care. Amanda had grown up believing her father was a hero who dedicated his life to reducing suffering for terminally ill patients, and his funeral had been attended by hundreds of colleagues, former patients' families, and medical students who credited Jonathan with inspiring their own careers in medicine. Amanda herself had become a pediatric surgeon partly because of her father's influence, and she had always treasured their weekly conversations about medical ethics, patient care, and the sacred responsibility that doctors bore to protect and heal the people who trusted them with their lives. Standing in Jonathan's home office surrounded by evidence of his secret crimes, Amanda felt as though the man who had raised her and shaped her moral foundation had been replaced by a stranger whose capacity for evil she couldn't comprehend or accept. The discovery began innocently when Amanda decided to donate her father's extensive medical library to Boston Medical College, where Jonathan had taught for over 30 years and where Amanda had completed her own medical degree. Jonathan had always been meticulous about organizing his professional materials, and Amanda expected to find carefully cataloged research papers, textbooks, and correspondence with other medical professionals. Instead, she found a hidden compartment behind Jonathan's bookshelf that contained a collection of unmarked journals, patient files that should have been destroyed decades earlier, and photographs that documented medical procedures that violated every principle of ethical medicine. The first journal Amanda opened contained detailed notes about something called Project Mercy, which appeared to be Jonathan's code name for a systematic program of murdering patients who met certain criteria that he had established based on his own assessment of their quality of life, family circumstances, and potential burden on society. Amanda spent 3 sleepless days reading through Jonathan's secret journals, each entry revealing new depths to his systematic approach to murder and his complete absence of remorse for the lives he had taken. The journals revealed that Jonathan had been killing patients for over 25 years, beginning during his residency at Massachusetts General Hospital and continuing throughout his career at 3 different medical institutions. His victims included elderly patients with dementia, children with severe disabilities, terminal cancer patients whose deaths he accelerated without their consent, and mentally ill patients who he deemed burdens on their families and society. Jonathan had kept meticulous records of each murder, including photographs of his victims before and after their deaths, detailed notes about the methods he used to kill them without detection, and his own psychological analysis of why each victim deserved to die according to his twisted moral framework. The most disturbing aspect of Jonathan's journals was the clinical detachment with which he described his murders and the intellectual pride he took in his ability to kill patients without arousing suspicion from colleagues or family members. Patient presented with advanced Parkinson's disease and moderate cognitive impairment, read one typical entry. Family expressed concern about long-term care costs and emotional burden. Administered lethal dose of morphine during routine pain management visit. Death occurred within 6 hours and was attributed to natural disease progression. Family expressed gratitude for my compassionate care during patients' final hours. Jonathan had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for murdering patients over the years, using his knowledge of pharmacology and pathology to cause deaths that would be indistinguishable from natural complications of existing medical conditions. Amanda discovered that Jonathan had targeted specific categories of patients based on his own eugenic beliefs about who deserved to live and who represented burdens that society would be better off without. His victims included children with Down syndrome, elderly patients with Alzheimer's disease, young adults with severe mental illness, and terminal patients whose families lacked the financial resources to provide extensive care. Jonathan had rationalized these murders by claiming that he was providing a merciful service to both the patients and their families, but his journals revealed that his true motivation was a God complex that allowed him to make life-and-death decisions based on his personal assessment of human worth and social utility. The journals also revealed that Jonathan had used his position as a respected physician to cover up his crimes and deflect any suspicion that might arise about unusual patient death rates in the units where he worked. He had cultivated relationships with medical examiners, hospital administrators, and nursing staff who trusted his medical opinions and rarely questioned his determinations about cause of death or the appropriateness of his treatment decisions. Jonathan had even published research papers about palliative care and medical ethics that established him as an expert in end-of-life decision-making, providing him with additional credibility that made it even less likely that anyone would suspect his true activities. Amanda's horror deepened when she realized that some of Jonathan's victims had been patients she remembered him discussing during her childhood and teenage years. Jonathan had often brought home stories about particularly challenging cases, describing his efforts to provide comfort and dignity to dying patients and their families. Amanda now realized that many of these touching anecdotes about her father's compassionate care had actually been descriptions of murders that Jonathan had committed while presenting himself as a dedicated healer. The revelation that her father had been bragging about his murders to his own daughter, disguised as examples of medical compassion, made Amanda physically ill as she contemplated the extent of his psychological manipulation and narcissism. One of the most devastating discoveries came when Amanda found evidence that Jonathan had murdered at least 12 children over his career, including infants with birth defects and older children with developmental disabilities. The photographs of these young victims were particularly disturbing because they showed Jonathan posing with the children shortly before their deaths, smiling at the camera while holding syringes or other medical equipment that he would use to end their lives. Amanda had to stop reading several times during her investigation of the pediatric cases, as the combination of Jonathan's clinical notes and photographic evidence made it impossible to maintain any emotional distance from the magnitude of his crimes. Amanda's investigation revealed that Jonathan had kept detailed psychological profiles of his victims' families, studying their emotional vulnerabilities and financial circumstances to determine which patients could be murdered without generating suspicious inquiries about the circumstances of their deaths. He targeted families who were emotionally exhausted by long-term caregiving responsibilities, financially stressed by medical expenses, or socially isolated without strong support networks that might advocate for thorough investigations of unexpected deaths. Jonathan had exploited these families' trust and desperation to commit murders while presenting himself as a compassionate physician who was helping them navigate difficult end-of-life decisions. The scope of Jonathan's crimes became even more apparent when Amanda discovered that he had maintained contact with other physicians who shared his eugenic beliefs, and who may have been involved in similar murder schemes at hospitals across the country. Jonathan's correspondence with these colleagues revealed a network of medical professionals who believed they had the right to make life-and-death decisions for vulnerable patients based on their own assessments of quality of life and social worth. The letters discussed methods for killing patients without detection, strategies for avoiding suspicion from colleagues and administrators, and philosophical justifications for what they termed compassionate elimination of people they considered burdens on society. Amanda faced an impossible moral dilemma as she processed the evidence of her father's crimes and tried to decide what to do with the information she had uncovered. Reporting Jonathan's murders to authorities would destroy his reputation and legacy, potentially invalidating decades of legitimate medical research and causing immeasurable pain to the families who had trusted him with their loved ones' care. Many of Jonathan's former patients' families had donated money to medical research foundations in his honor, and several hospitals had dedicated wings and research centers to his memory following his death. Exposing his crimes would devastate these families and institutions while potentially undermining public trust in the medical profession at a time when healthcare providers were already struggling with credibility issues. On the other hand, Amanda knew that Jonathan's victims deserved justice and that the families who had lost loved ones to his murders deserved to know the truth about how their relatives had actually died. Amanda also worried that other physicians in Jonathan's network might still be active and continuing to murder vulnerable patients at hospitals across the country. The evidence she had found included recent correspondence suggesting that at least some of Jonathan's colleagues were still engaged in systematic patient murders, using methods and justifications that Jonathan had helped develop over his career. Amanda's professional obligations as a physician also weighed heavily on her decision-making process. The Hippocratic Oath required her to first do no harm, and she struggled with whether exposing Jonathan's crimes would cause more harm than good, given the potential impact on public trust in medicine and the emotional trauma that would be inflicted on victims' families who had spent years believing their loved ones had received compassionate end-of-life care. Amanda also worried about the impact that her father's crimes might have on her own medical career, as colleagues and patients might question whether she had inherited Jonathan's psychological pathologies or had been complicit in his activities. The turning point in Amanda's decision-making process came when she discovered evidence that Jonathan had been planning to recruit her into his murder network before his unexpected death. Among his final journal entries were detailed notes about Amanda's medical training, her access to pediatric patients, and his assessment of her psychological suitability for what he termed advanced compassionate care. Jonathan had apparently been grooming Amanda to become his successor, planning to gradually introduce her to his philosophy of selective patient elimination once she had established herself professionally and developed the clinical skills necessary to murder patients without detection. Jonathan's recruitment plans included specific strategies for overcoming Amanda's moral objections to patient murder, beginning with cases involving severely disabled children whose deaths could be presented as merciful relief from suffering. He had identified several of Amanda's current patients who met his criteria for elimination, and had been preparing to approach Amanda with arguments about the futility of continued treatment and the burden these children represented for their families and society. The discovery that Jonathan had been planning to corrupt her own medical practice and turn her into an accomplice in systematic murder finally convinced Amanda that his crimes were too dangerous to keep secret, regardless of the personal and professional consequences she might face. Amanda's first step was to contact the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, which handled cases involving abuse of authority by government officials and licensed professionals. Special Agent Michael Romano, who had extensive experience investigating healthcare fraud and medical malpractice, agreed to meet with Amanda to review the evidence she had discovered. Agent Romano was initially skeptical about the scope of the crimes Amanda described, but his attitude changed dramatically when she showed him Jonathan's journals, photographs, and correspondence with other physicians. "Dr. Walsh, what you've uncovered here represents one of the largest serial killing cases in American medical history," Agent Romano told her. "Your father wasn't just murdering patients. He was operating as part of a network that may be responsible for hundreds of deaths across multiple states." The federal investigation that followed Amanda's report required her to cooperate extensively with law enforcement agencies, medical licensing boards, and hospital administrators as they worked to identify all of Jonathan's victims and determine which of his colleagues might have been involved in similar crimes. Amanda had to provide detailed explanations of medical procedures and terminology found in Jonathan's journals, help investigators understand the significance of various pieces of evidence, and assist in identifying potential witnesses who might have observed suspicious activities during Jonathan's career. The investigation revealed that Jonathan had murdered at least 87 patients over 25 years, making him one of the most prolific medical serial killers in American history. The victims ranged in age from 6 months to 93 years old, and included patients from every demographic group and medical condition imaginable. Jonathan's crimes had been committed at 4 different hospitals in 3 states, and his methods had become increasingly sophisticated as he gained experience and confidence in his ability to avoid detection by colleagues and investigators. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Jonathan's network of like-minded physicians had been responsible for potentially hundreds of additional murders at hospitals across the country. Federal investigators identified at least 12 other physicians who had been corresponding with Jonathan about patient elimination techniques, and several of these doctors were found to have suspicious patient death rates that warranted further investigation. The network had operated for over 2 decades, sharing information about murder methods, victim selection criteria, and strategies for avoiding detection by hospital administrators and law enforcement agencies. The public revelation of Jonathan's crimes created a national scandal that dominated news coverage for months and triggered congressional hearings about oversight of medical professionals and hospital patient safety procedures. Amanda found herself at the center of a media storm, with reporters and television producers seeking interviews about her discovery of her father's crimes and her decision to report them to authorities. The attention was overwhelming and often hostile, with some commentators questioning whether Amanda had known about her father's activities during her childhood or had been motivated by financial gain rather than genuine concern for justice. Amanda's decision to expose her father's crimes also had devastating consequences for Jonathan's former patients' families, many of whom had cherished memories of his compassionate care during their loved ones' final days. The revelation that their relatives had been murdered rather than dying naturally from their medical conditions created a new form of grief and trauma that required extensive counseling and support services. Some families sued the hospitals where Jonathan had worked, seeking damages for the emotional trauma of learning that their loved ones had been victims of murder rather than recipients of merciful end-of-life care. The medical community's response to the Jonathan Walsh scandal was mixed, with some physicians praising Amanda for her courage in exposing dangerous criminal activity, while others criticized her for destroying trust in the medical profession and causing unnecessary trauma to victims' families. Medical schools began reviewing their curricula to ensure that ethics training adequately addressed the potential for abuse of physician authority, and hospitals implemented new oversight procedures designed to identify patterns of unusual patient deaths that might indicate criminal activity by medical staff. Amanda's own medical career was profoundly affected by her father's crimes and her decision to expose them. Some colleagues and patients viewed her with suspicion, wondering whether she might have inherited Jonathan's psychological pathologies or been influenced by his twisted philosophy of patient care. Other medical professionals, however, recognized Amanda as a hero who had sacrificed her personal comfort and professional reputation to protect vulnerable patients and bring a dangerous criminal network to justice. The legal proceedings that followed the investigation were complex and lengthy, involving criminal prosecutions, civil lawsuits, medical licensing board actions, and congressional oversight hearings. Several of Jonathan's colleagues were indicted on murder charges, while others lost their medical licenses or were banned from practicing medicine in certain states. The hospitals where Jonathan had worked faced massive financial settlements and implemented new patient safety protocols designed to prevent similar crimes from occurring in the future. Amanda testified as a key witness in multiple trials, describing her discovery of Jonathan's crimes and explaining the medical evidence that proved his systematic murder of vulnerable patients. The testimony was emotionally devastating, as Amanda had to publicly acknowledge that her beloved father had been a monster who had violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. The defense attorneys for Jonathan's co-conspirators tried to discredit Amanda by suggesting that she had misunderstood her father's medical records or had been motivated by attention-seeking rather than genuine concern for justice. The most difficult aspect of the trials was Amanda's confrontation with some of Jonathan's surviving colleagues, physicians who had worked alongside him for years and claimed to have had no knowledge of his criminal activities. Amanda found it difficult to believe that experienced medical professionals could have been completely unaware of Jonathan's suspicious patient death rates and unusual treatment decisions, and she suspected that some of his colleagues had chosen to remain willfully ignorant rather than risk their careers by reporting their suspicions to authorities. 5 years after exposing her father's crimes, Amanda published a memoir titled The Monster I Called Father, A Doctor's Journey from Admiration to Horror, which became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary film that won several awards for its exploration of medical ethics and the potential for corruption within healthcare institutions. The book provided Amanda with a platform to advocate for stronger oversight of medical professionals and better protection for vulnerable patients who might be targeted by physicians who abuse their authority and position of trust. Amanda used the proceeds from her book and media appearances to establish the Jonathan Walsh Victims Memorial Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provides support services to families who have been affected by medical crimes and advocates for stronger patient safety protections in hospitals and healthcare facilities. The foundation also funds research into the psychological factors that might predispose medical professionals to abuse their authority and commit crimes against patients, with the goal of developing screening procedures that could identify potentially dangerous physicians before they harm patients. The Foundation's work has led to significant changes in medical education and hospital administration, including mandatory training programs on medical ethics and patient advocacy, improved oversight of physician decision-making in end-of-life cases, and whistleblower protection programs that encourage healthcare workers to report suspicious activities without fear of retaliation. Amanda travels extensively, speaking to medical students, healthcare administrators, and patient advocacy groups about the importance of maintaining vigilance against the potential for abuse within the medical profession. Amanda's personal healing process required years of therapy and support from other family members of criminals, as she struggled to reconcile her loving memories of Jonathan as a father with the horrific evidence of his crimes as a physician. The revelation that her moral and professional development had been shaped by a serial killer forced Amanda to question many of her fundamental beliefs about human nature, medical ethics, and the reliability of her own judgment about people she trusted. She had to rebuild her identity as both a physician and a person, separating the valuable lessons she had learned about medicine and patient care from the corrupted source of her early education. One of the most challenging aspects of Amanda's recovery was dealing with guilt about the patients her father had murdered and her own failure to recognize the warning signs of his criminal behavior. Amanda spent countless hours analyzing her memories of Jonathan, looking for clues that might have indicated his true nature and questioning whether she should have suspected something was wrong based on his attitudes toward certain types of patients or his reactions to ethical dilemmas in medicine. Ultimately, Amanda learned to accept that Jonathan had been an exceptionally skilled manipulator who had successfully deceived not only his family, but also hundreds of colleagues and thousands of patients over the course of his career. Amanda's relationship with her mother, Patricia Walsh, was severely strained by the revelation of Jonathan's crimes and Amanda's decision to expose them publicly. Patricia had been married to Jonathan for 42 years and had built her identity around being the wife of a respected physician and medical researcher. The discovery that her husband had been a serial killer who had used their home as a base for planning and documenting his crimes was devastating for Patricia, who struggled with depression and anxiety as she tried to process the magnitude of Jonathan's betrayal of their family and his victims. Patricia initially blamed Amanda for destroying Jonathan's reputation and legacy, arguing that the crimes should have remained secret to protect the feelings of victims' families and preserve public trust in the medical profession. The conflict between Amanda and her mother lasted for over 2 years and required extensive family therapy before they were able to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty about Jonathan's crimes and mutual support for each other's healing process. Patricia eventually became an advocate for the victims' families and helped establish support groups for relatives of medical professionals who had committed crimes against patients. The impact of Jonathan's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims and their families, affecting the entire medical community and raising important questions about the potential for abuse of physician authority and the adequacy of current oversight systems for monitoring medical practice. Medical licensing boards in multiple states revised their procedures for investigating complaints against physicians and monitoring patterns of unusual patient outcomes that might indicate criminal activity. Hospitals implemented new peer review processes designed to identify physicians whose treatment decisions or patient outcomes deviated significantly from accepted standards of care. The Jonathan Walsh case also prompted important discussions about the role of family members and colleagues in reporting suspected criminal activity by medical professionals, particularly in cases where the potential crimes involve vulnerable patients who may not be able to advocate for themselves. Amanda's decision to report her father's crimes despite the personal cost became a model for other healthcare workers who discovered evidence of criminal activity by colleagues, and her advocacy work has helped establish legal protections for medical professionals who report suspected abuse or malpractice by other physicians. 10 years after exposing her father's crimes, Amanda continues to practice pediatric surgery while also serving as a national advocate for patient safety and medical ethics reform. She has testified before Congress multiple times about the need for stronger oversight of medical professionals, and has worked with medical schools to develop improved ethics training programs that specifically address the potential for abuse of physician authority. Amanda's work has been recognized with numerous awards from patient advocacy organizations, medical ethics societies, and law enforcement agencies. Amanda's experience taught her that the people we trust most, parents, colleagues, authority figures, are sometimes capable of the greatest evil. and that recognizing and responding to such evil requires moral courage that may come at enormous personal cost. Jonathan Walsh had used his position as a respected physician and loving father to mask decades of systematic murder, exploiting the trust and admiration of everyone around him to continue his crimes without detection. Amanda's decision to expose his crimes had destroyed her idealized memories of her father and subjected her to years of public scrutiny and professional challenges. But it had also saved the lives of countless future victims and helped establish important protections for vulnerable patients throughout the healthcare system. The most important lesson Amanda learned from her horrific discovery was that love and respect for authority figures should never prevent someone from taking action when they discover evidence of serious crimes, regardless of the personal consequences or the damage that might be caused to cherished relationships and institutions. Jonathan had counted on his family's love and his colleagues' respect to protect him from exposure and accountability, but Amanda's courage in choosing justice over comfort had ultimately brought him to justice and prevented his network of criminal physicians from claiming additional victims. Her story became a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important moral choices require us to sacrifice everything we thought we knew about the people we love in order to protect the innocent people they may be harming.